Hello, everyone, and welcome to our environmental injustice workshop. Just admitting everyone right now. Appreciate you guys being here. Really love all of the RSVPs and all the great attendance to talk about this really important subject. All right, admitting everyone.
Hey, Cop.
Hey, thanks for coming. All right, I'm just gonna give everyone some time to sign on. But yeah, again, thank you guys for coming. Really excited to talk to you about this really important topic that has just such a deep history, so much to learn, barely scratching the surface, but I hope this inspires you guys to keep doing your own research too. Cool, so I'm gonna wait a couple minutes to give people some time to tune in. We actually had like 76 RSVPs, which is really awesome. And we are streaming this to Facebook Live as well, so it will live there if you guys want to watch it again. With that being said, when we pause for questions, if you don't want to be recorded, make sure you turn off your camera and your audio. Yeah, I guess just to start about introducing myself real quick. My name is Maddie, and I am the Program and Outreach Director at Debris Free Oceans. So I've been coordinating all of our virtual programs recently while we've been in quarantine, which has been quite an experience, but definitely really looking forward to this, this event. I think it's definitely the most important one we've had so far. Sophie, I'm going to make you a co-host so that you can admit people if we get started. Oh, Teju, I need to make you a co-host too. I haven't done that yet. Okay. Well, since we have Sophia who's going to be monitoring the waiting room, I'll go ahead and get started. But yeah, like I said, I'm Maddie, Program Director at DFO, and today we're talking about environmental injustice in the Caribbean and also further into the United States. We have an awesome speaker, Teju, who I'll talk a bit about in a second, that we're really excited to have here with us. But before we get started, just want to go through some housekeeping. So as you guys can see, we are not in webinar mode, and that's intentional. Actually, something that Teju's been doing with her workshops, because we're able to see each other, we're able to interact, we're able to ask questions, and I think it's a lot more personal and, again, interactive, so that's what we're doing for this workshop. And so we will mute you guys while we are speaking, because we have it set up while I'm sharing a screen. The videos will shift based on whether myself or Teju is talking. And so we will pause occasionally for questions a couple times throughout the slides. So we encourage you guys to maybe wait until then and turn on your video and have a dialogue. But also you're more than welcome to just submit your questions in the chat if you're more comfortable with doing that. On the note of the chat, I just wanted to add that I am not an expert in this field at all. I am learning. I'm excited to be learning. But if I say anything that comes off offensive or just doesn't sit well with you, put it in the chat. Let me know, and because I'm learning here with you guys too. So. Just a quick outline of what we will be going through. First, we'll do a little background quickly about DFO, if any of Teju's friends are tuning in and don't really know about us. And then give Teju an opportunity to introduce herself. And then she will start speaking a little bit about injustices in the Caribbean and Jamaica as a Jamaican American. And then I'll talk about how that kind of relates to things going on in Miami and a couple of historical examples of environmental racism in Miami. And then finally, we'll have Teju speak a bit more about kind of just the deeper history of environmental racism in Florida and also in the United States. But then also what we can do looking to the future and how saying no to plastics can play a large role in this as well. And so just quickly, a quick intro about DFO, and then I'll be introducing Teju. For those of you who don't know us, we are a cleanup organization, 501c3 nonprofit in Miami, dedicated to eradicating marine debris, not only through cleanups, but through inspiring communities to just manage the life cycle of plastics and waste responsibly by working with the community locally. So we do cleanups, but we also do education. We've worked with like 8,000 students in South Florida, and we also do sustainability consulting to get businesses to transition away from single-use plastics and switch to reusable items. So I found Teju actually on Instagram, and while diversifying my feed, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have begun doing, I know I started doing it. Again, we need to keep doing it. And I saw she was having an interactive workshop, and I was a little intimidated, but I was like, I just want to sign up and start dipping my toes in these things because we need to learn, and the best place to start is as soon as you can. And Sophia, our Chef Andrew Scholar Director, who's helping us with questions, and also our co-founder, Katie Pomerantz, also joined. And it was a really eye-opening, impactful workshop. And we ended up reaching up to Teju about collaborating for an event so that we could bring some of this education to our following. And she said yes. We were really excited. She's coming to us from California today. And she has a Bachelor of Arts and also a Master of Science in things related to sociology, urban planning, activism, environmental justice, like you name it, related to social and environmental causes. She's probably done it. She's also an artist and a poet. I swear she does everything. And I also just wanted to point out that she's presented and facilitated at events in different states and also throughout the world. So we're really excited to have her here. And now I'm going to give her a second to introduce herself.
Thank you for that introduction, Maddie. My name is Teju. I am currently here in Oakland, California, which is Ohlone Chichenyo land. I am a geographer and writer by training. And my focus is really on space, place, and identity, and connecting the dots between global issues that have to do with the environment, climate, and social justice. I've lived in about 7 countries and done research in many countries, so I'm always looking for ways to talk about how embedded our systems are, and how our identity affects the way that we see the world and how we could show up better in movements and in solidarity. So I'm happy to be here bringing some of the content from my workshops and trainings to the debris-free community. I've been talking about some issues that I'm passionate about and that are personal to me. So I grew up in a place called West Oakland, California, which is now experiencing rapid gentrification, but at the time had the highest rates of asthma for children. And I also spent time growing up in Spanish Town, Jamaica, which is about 40 miles outside of Kingston, and at that time was not so developed, and is now experiencing quite a bit of climate change. And so my relationship to environmental equity and climate justice has a lot to do with my identity. Next slide, please, Maddie. So being a Jamaican American, I'm very connected to nature and my island. And although in some places in the US, we are not heavily aware of climate change issues and the way that it impacts us, at the Caribbean, it's a huge issue. One of the main facets for the degradation of the environment in the Caribbean is tourism, and especially cruise ships. Cruise ships pollute the sea and have led to a lot of reef erosion, and reefs help keep the ocean and the sea clean and to keep carbon dioxide in the water and not going up into the atmosphere. And the other issues that have affected the Caribbean, including reef erosion, has also been sea level rise. So one of the beaches that I used to go to as a child is no longer there because the sea level has risen. And what was left of the beach, the Jamaican government allowed a company to dig out to build a road from Kingston to Ocho Rios, which is a tourist location. And when I was in Jamaica this past January, there was an earthquake that was about 7.3 magnitude off the coast of Montego Bay, which created some tsunami warnings, which has never been the case in the history of Jamaica. In addition to decreasing sea life, especially turtles in places like Barbados, climate change has really affected the entire environment in the Caribbean, and that coupled with the pollution of tourism and the impact of tourism makes it even more difficult for Jamaica and the Caribbean to deal with environmental issues. And so when we're talking about exploring other places and traveling, it's important to think about what our impact is on the other places that we go to and the natural beauty that often we're going to escape to when we're traveling. There's also some ways that when we go to do humanitarian efforts in these places that actually we're not helping, but we're hurting the community, and what we're thinking that we're doing, which is helping, is not actually helping in the way that's needed. And so when I talk about climate justice and environmental justice, I like to just mention these ways that it affects the Caribbean, and especially sea level rise, which is something that's imminent for all of us, but often we don't feel it unless we live in a specific geography. So I'll turn it over to Maddie to talk more about sea level rise in the case of South Florida.
Thanks, Teju. And yeah, before jumping into sea level rise, just wanted to note that a lot of the tourism that she's talking about is likely coming from our backyard port of Miami. So just something to keep in mind when planning travel trips and whatnot. And like she said, this also plays a role in terms of sea level rise in Miami and climate gentrification. So this is just one specific example that's happening now. So it's kind of making some headlines, but it's going to intensify as climate change continues. But this example is Little Haiti, which is pointed out on this map here. It's a majority Black community, and it sits at 7 to 14 feet above sea level, which depending on where you're tuning in from might not sound like a lot, but is here. If you compare it to Miami Beach, the average sea level or elevation above sea level is about 4 feet. And so historically, when people were moving to Miami, a lot of white communities flocked to Miami Beach because they really wanted these beautiful oceanfront views. But now that it's a threat, we're seeing development move inland, especially in Little Haiti. So much so that reports are coming out where full apartment units are getting eviction notices and getting demolished, and these people are actually forced to move outside of Little Haiti because the rent prices are going up incredibly, and it's really displacing these people that have lived there forever. And some reporting have spoke to people that take really long bus rides just to go back to Little Haiti because they've grown up there and there's so much culture there, and it's getting taken away. So just two things to kind of keep in mind that are only going to potentially intensify. And some other examples of environmental racism in Miami. This is an example from hurricane debris. Actually, after Hurricane Irma, we had a whole lot of debris around Miami-Dade County. And they ended up setting up 6 dumping sites for this debris to get handled. And 5 of those dumping sites were either near to landfills, by airport parking lots, in an industrial area. But this one dumping ground here was actually in Liberty City in Poinciana Industrial Park. That is a residential area, majority Black and Hispanic. And so in this picture, you can see literally that dumping ground right next to people's homes. And they said that there wasn't a fence even surrounding it until a couple of weeks after it was placed there. And residents were reporting sinus issues, migraines, asthma, were wearing masks. If you're interested in it, there's a lot of reporting by the Miami Herald and WLRN. But this is something else to keep in mind as hurricanes are expected to intensify in strength and frequency with climate warming.
I just want to add that often in places like Miami and South Florida, Caribbean communities migrate there because the opportunities on their islands are not so many because of things like tourism and colonialism. And so they migrate to places in Florida, and often there's not many neighborhoods that they're able to live. And so they end up living in spaces that are the most undesirable places, near pollution, near fossil fuels, without infrastructure. And so as climate change increases and sea level rises, those same places which were seen as undesirable are now becoming more desirable because they're on higher ground. And so those people are displaced yet again because they now live in a place which is seen as desirable because it is safer. And so they're displaced to another place. So this cycle of it being Black and brown communities, Black and brown countries that suffer the most as a result of climate change and environmental injustice is present globally.
And then to just give a couple of historic examples of environmental racism in South Florida. I learned so much from reading about Virginia Key, and I've been going to school across the street from Virginia Key for 8 years. And again, this is just me kind of emphasizing to you guys how important it is to take the little steps to read up on your history of the places that are around you every day, because it's very, very important. So Virginia Key Beach, I actually always thought was the first colored beach in Miami, but it's actually not the case. Fisher Island was actually the first all-colored beach. And this was because a Black millionaire named Dana Dorsey, he actually bought Fisher Island and opened up a colored Black public beach there. And he had done this before with the park. And so he did this for Fisher Island, and it was the first open access beach for Black and brown communities. But it only lasted for about 1.5 years when property tax increases forced him to sell the island. And then for over 20 years, there was no public beach access for Black and brown communities in Miami. And this was like a side of environmental racism that I didn't necessarily originally think of, where it's the kind of access and availability of these communities for these natural resources. And so Virginia Key Beach opened in 1945, but the reason it did open was actually because of a wade-in protest organized by the NAACP down here, where a group of protesters went into the all-white Haulover Island, or Haulover Beach, which is another beach that I've been to so many times, and I didn't know this like really important history about it. So after this wade-in, it wasn't even kind of the community necessarily being all that kind according to reporting, but it was really that they didn't want these protests disrupting white tourism on their all-white beach. So they opened Virginia Key Beach, but what some people don't know is that when it was opened, there was no road or bridge to Virginia Key, so you could only get there by boat. So was that really an open beach? Not really sure. For 3 years, there was no access by road until the Rickenbacker Causeway was built in 1947. But shortly after that, the wastewater treatment plant, the largest one in the county, was built. And a couple years after that, the landfill was built, which has since shut down because of problems. But as soon as there was road access, it became a bit of a dumping ground. And then in the 1980s, it actually closed for 2 decades, and the city was kind of citing high maintenance costs. But there's a little bit brighter history coming at the end of this. In 1999, the Miami City Commission actually established a trust to help. They kind of called it a 2-pronged restoration effort, where it was historic restoration, but then also environmental restoration, so restoring some of the native plants there. It ended up being placed on the National Register of Historic Places, and again, opened in 2008 after some of this restoration was started. And I just wanted to just quickly add, because I love this park, we've worked with them for several cleanup events. They're just incredible staff, an incredible place to go and visit if you guys haven't been yet. And then this is my other example of a location that I've driven by so many times and didn't know this really shocking story. This is in the Grove. There was an incinerator actually called Old Smoky. It was opened in 1925 in the Western Grove, which used to be called the Colored Grove. It was a block away from the George Washington Carver Middle School that was traditionally all Black. And the reporting, actually, they have reporting of people, students saying that there would be ash flying through the windows of this school, and kids in that neighborhood would have to run inside whenever this incinerator was running. And unfortunately, I mean, not fortunately, but so this incinerator only was struck down in 1970, but this was only because the school, or according to reporting, only because the school had been desegregated and the parent of one of the white students had complained. And just because it's gone, its toxic effects honestly live on. There's studies out of the University of Miami that have actually linked a cancer cluster in the Western Grove, or the West Grove, to arsenic in the drinking water, which arsenic is associated with spew from incinerators. And so much so that there's actually now a court case where there are a bunch of plaintiffs suing Miami for not providing them with enough information about where they are living, and now they're experiencing all these negative health impacts. So there's a lot of information about this. I highly recommend reading up on it. And yeah, so at this point, we are planning to pause for questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Now people, if they want to turn off their video and ask a question, or ask a question in the chat, we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. If you could speak a little bit more about some of the effects of environmental injustice issues within tourism, because I know that in a lot of the Caribbean islands and even Latin America, South America, a lot of people's livelihoods depend on tourism. And so you kind of have this double-edged sword of the economic viability of tourism with the environmental detriments that come with it. So where are people kind of stuck in that?
Yeah, that's definitely a quandary, and one of the reasons why bad tourism practices continue is because they are economically viable. And in certain parts of Jamaica, for example, Montego Bay, which is one of the most popular places to travel to on vacation, and cruise ships land there, the economy is almost completely tourism. And as a result, people who are not in the tourist economy don't have any other opportunities. And so it's in a parish which has one of the highest crime rates, because there's a monopoly of tourism on the economy. The other issue with Montego Bay is that because all of the coastline is owned by resorts and hotels, that locals don't have access to the beaches, because the beaches are private and within the walls of resorts and hotels. So what that also means is that island people, Jamaican people, don't have access to the nature that is so much a part of our identity and culture. And so I think that has a mental detriment on the people in that area as well. And some of the ways that Jamaicans make money through tourism is by doing things like having jet skis, or allowing people to pet certain marine life. Lots of scuba diving, which disrupts the reefs. And so although this is economically viable, it's not actually sustainable, and over time it will no longer be economically viable, because the nature that people come to see will be eroded and degraded. Jamaica gets less and less green every year, so if you're not going to a green place with clean water, then you don't want to go there anymore. So I think the issue is not necessarily tourism itself, it's mass tourism, and it's tourism that's owned by mostly Western European and American companies. So the economic benefits of tourism don't actually affect the national domestic product of Jamaica as much as it seems like it does, because a lot of that money is extracted from Jamaica and sent back to the hotel corporations, which are usually in the UK, the US, or Canada. And so I think there has to be a shift in the economy. And one of the ways that I was hoping that would happen is the sheltering in place that needed to create a lockdown in Jamaica, but unfortunately what it has meant is that Jamaica has just opened up borders for tourism and nothing else. So I think the sort of complex and long-term answer is there needs to be a shift in what is seen as a viable economy, and also a focus on maybe sustainable community-based tourism, smaller scale tourism, rather than large scale hotels with big walls and cruise ships. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, because I think that is I don't have the answer to that question, but those are some thoughts.
We also now have some questions in the chat. I believe Julie has the first one, asking Teju for some examples of humanitarian efforts contributing to environmental issues in Jamaica or other places in the Caribbean.
Yeah, so Jamaica is an extremely Christian country. There's lots and lots of churches, and often the way that Americans specifically do humanitarian aid efforts in Jamaica is they go to build churches and schools. Why teenagers are who have enough skills to build churches and schools in Jamaica but not in the US, I will never understand. But somehow American teenagers are qualified to build churches and schools in Jamaica. But because these humanitarian efforts are usually for teenagers and they're usually for projects that can be done very quickly, the materials that are used are cheaper materials. The process usually pollutes more because there's a lot more toxins in the air going up in a short amount of time, which contributes to pollution and sends carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And because there's so much construction and building going on, not only because of Chinese companies, but also because of these smaller scale humanitarian projects, there's not a lot of regulations about what type of electricity goes into these places, what type of materials are used, if the materials are sustainable, if the building is hurricane resistant, all of these sort of things that an engineer and an architect would think about if they had the time and money and space. They sort of find ways to make these like Lego projects for outsiders who are young, usually young kids and teenagers, to come in and do. So the whole process of these buildings is not happening in a sustainable way or a way that makes sense for the geography of the place that they're in. And so I think there's a positive intention, but this intention comes from paternalism, that we don't have to have the same amount of skills and qualifications to build infrastructure in your country, but we wouldn't let teenagers build us a high school in Miami. So why is it okay in Jamaica or Ghana, for example? So I think those are some of the connections about those projects.
Sorry.
So we have a couple other questions in the chat. The next one is just asking for some resources to learn about climate gentrification.
Sorry, I'm making sure they don't call me back. So resources for climate gentrification, the number one that comes to mind is the Clio Institute. They do a lot of work educating and raising awareness about climate gentrification, but also training young students to also go out and continue that education. The University of Miami also has an environmental justice program, and the Abbas Center has some faculty that is doing some active research there as well. I also saw, sorry, I'm sneaking on the chat. Thank you for being on top of it, Sophia. Michael Kelly's question about this as well. And the resources I was reading was talking about relocation to North Miami, which truthfully, I'm not sure the exact details of what's around this area. If it's affordable housing, I'm not sure if it's an affordable housing program or if it's somewhere where there's affordable housing because of some environmental detriment, but definitely need to look into that.
What tends to happen is that usually when Black people are living in a place that has been divested from and disenfranchised from that time, from the time that they moved there, the land value on that place is very low. And so developers are able to come in and buy the land cheaply and shut down all of the fossil fuel industries, build up condos and sell them for a profit at market rate. And usually those people are displaced to other sort of marginal places. In some cases, they're marginal because they also were industrial or had some sort of toxic ground contamination, but in some cases, they're not places that are necessarily bad for the environment. But what tends to happen then is that industry that was closed down in that neighborhood that's now gentrified will move to these places with the people, or they'll reopen a plant. For example, here in Northern California in the Bay Area, many people from the neighborhood of West Oakland, which has been historically Black, were displaced to Stockton. And what happened in Stockton is they reopened a waste plant that started polluting the water. So the people who had suffered from asthma because of pollution in West Oakland then moved to another place where something that had been off for a while was turned back on, which caused pollution for these same people who had been displaced. So environmental racism follows the geography of the people, because although the land is also seen as being devalued, it's seen as being devalued because of who lives there. So when people move, if they're seen as undesirable people, then you put all the undesirable things with those people. And that's sort of a cycle that happens in this country because of how deeply embedded environmental segregation and environmental racism is.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for all of the questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Let's see. And now these are some slides from the original workshop that Katie, Sophia, and I got to attend. It was entitled Connecting the Dots Between Black Liberation and Environmentalism. You'll see in a sec, but she'll touch a bit about kind of broader themes in Florida and also in the United States. So I'll go to the next slide.
So this training that I did, which was about connecting the dots between Black liberation and environmentalism, was really showing some historic moments in the United States that have contributed to environmental racism, specifically for the Black community, and the ways that Black liberation is tied up into environmental liberation. Because from this beginning of the degradation of the environment here in this country, there was also the oppression of Black people. So several million enslaved Africans were brought over to the US to work on plantations to yield crops that the white European settlers could export for profit. And so from the beginning of that process, there was lots and lots of deforestation. They needed to clear land. In Virginia and South Carolina particularly, a lot of swamps were converted into rice fields, and a lot of non-native plants were planted as well, and several areas that had been ecologically diverse were transitioned into spaces of monoculture, and Black enslaved Africans were brought over to work that land and to yield as much crops from the land as possible. So rather than farming as a subsistence being about yielding as much as you need to survive, it became about extracting as many crops from the land as possible. And the people who were doing this, who were forced to do this, were Black people. And so as soil erosion was created by cultivating cotton, and tobacco has huge environmental effects on the land, and tobacco was produced in mass for the first couple of centuries of European settlers coming here. And so as soil erosion is happening, there's mass deforestation. We start to see the first shifts in the climate, starting with plantation slavery, and starting with sort of monoculture and having one crop being planted in mass. And so over the history of this country, there has been the suppressing and distorting of Black communities' relationships to land and space. This started with being forced to be slaves and work on plantations. And then after slavery was abolished, many Black people became sharecroppers or farmers and would often work in some cases on the same land that they had been slaves on, but instead would farm mostly for subsistence to feed themselves, their family, and the community. And so over time, because having access to land gives you access to wealth, there were many tactics used to get Black farmers off of the land. Specifically, this was done in Florida, where there was one of the highest percentage of thriving Black communities and thriving Black farms. Some of the tactics used from the KKK and others was killing Black farmers, poisoning their crops, poisoning their land. In some cases in the South, and especially in Florida, there were these systems where Black towns had to be tied to white towns, meaning they couldn't get any money from the state for infrastructure unless it was funneled through a white town. And so the white town could decide not to distribute any of that money. They could also say that, all of the food or most of the food that is farmed from that community has to be given for free to the white community. And so what this meant is that a lot of Black communities weren't able to have the proper infrastructure to protect against natural disasters. Now, obviously, natural disasters have been happening in this country since the beginning of time, but they are definitely increasing because of climate change. And so when natural disasters happened, it was very hard for Black farmers in Florida to recover. And that, in addition to migration, which I'll talk about in a second, meant that there was a lot less people able to work the farm because it was no longer economically, socially, or culturally viable for Black farmers. So all of these tactics were used to further displace Black people from the land and make it really hard for them to farm and create a life from agriculture. And so one of the ways that migration was spurred was really the Jim Crow South and the overt racist laws and the lynching that led people to want to migrate north. Next slide, please, Maddie. And so between about 1914 and 1970, 6 million Black people migrated from the South to the Midwest, the Northeast, the East, and the West. This was an influx during World War II because people were going to work on ports, like here in the Port of Oakland, or going to work in factories in the Midwest, like in Chicago and Minneapolis. All of these jobs are booming because there was a war. And so Black people were shifting the demographics of these cities, and that meant that the Black communities were made to live in the most undesirable parts of the city, the parts of the city that were closest to industry, that did not have a lot of money, that did not have a lot of commerce. And so it is the case then and today that most fossil fuel industries are located in or near Black neighborhoods, Latinx communities, or on Indigenous land. More than half of the people of color in this country live near fossil fuel industries. And this started really in the 1940s and 1950s as the demographic shifts in US cities led to urban racist planning. So as I'm sure some of you are familiar with, growing up with a Black town across the freeway or across the railroad tracks, and that's because cities started planning in ways that separated white communities and Black communities. And they also started building more freeways because white people who had been living in these cities no longer wanted to live near Black people. They wanted to live in the suburbs, so they needed freeways to drive out to their suburbs and then come back in the morning to work in the city center, which usually had the heart of the economy. And so we can see a sort of building of an environmental justice movement really in the early 1960s, late 1950s. And I want to use the example of NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And it's called the People's First Environmental Law. And NEPA was spurred from the Freeway Riots, which is when residents, Black, white residents all over the country started rioting and protesting against cities building freeways right through their neighborhoods. They didn't want to have the pollution and noise from cars. They didn't think it was fair to seize homes, to demolish them, to build a freeway. So they started rioting. And in 1970, NEPA was unanimously put into law. And basically what NEPA allows is for communities to intervene when large-scale projects are happening in their community and may impact their environment. So it requires the government or a development company to do an environmental impact report saying these are the ways that our project is going to impact the environment of this neighborhood, and the neighborhood residents can have a chance to intervene and say, we don't want this in our community because of pollution, because of segregation, etc. Now, NEPA is not completely fully effective, but right now Trump is trying to completely get rid of it. So it's really important right now to know about NEPA and to make sure that we support it, because it is useful to intervene when previously there was no other way to intervene. And so we see the 1960s with the start of the environmental justice movement, which is right on the hills and intertwined with the civil rights movement. And also at this time in the Caribbean and Africa, we see decolonization and Caribbean and African countries asking for control over their natural resources from European countries. So globally, there is this awareness about environmental justice for Black people as it connects to resources and space. Next slide, please. And so what happens in the 1970s is we start to see this boom of this mainstream environmental movement. It's mostly white people advocating to protect wild animals and natural places. And it's a movement that for the most part doesn't acknowledge indigeneity or people of color. It's seen as a sign of sort of colorblind movement, where all of a sudden it's about clean air, clean water, saving the Grand Canyon. It's not about Black or brown communities. It's not about indigenous land. It's not about colonialism. And so one of the reasons why white people flocked to this movement is because there was no push to understand how their whiteness and their ancestors' history may have contributed to the degradation of the earth and its people. And even though there was some tactics that were clearly appropriated from the civil rights movement and the environmental justice movement, there was not an integration with Black movements that were happening at the time. Next slide. And so we fast forward to the early 1990s, and activists of color go to Washington, D.C., and they have the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And they say, we've been at the forefront of fighting for environmental justice for the last few decades. We've been ignored and invisibilized in this movement. And so if you want to talk about having a real environmental movement, it needs to be focused on justice. It needs to center Black and brown people. And so at this summit in Washington, D.C., the delegates drafted and adopted 17 principles of environmental justice for the growing grassroots movement, and said, if you really care about the earth and ecology, then you also have to care about Black people and indigenous people who are often having the burden of this pollution. Next slide. And so now what we see is a lot of conversations happening around environmental justice, and most of them are happening with a good intention, but often big greens and environmentalists who usually don't work on environmental justice issues are sort of co-opting this language of environmental justice, but not linking it to Black liberation and not linking it to this very violent history of the degradation of Black bodies and the land. Next slide. And so I want to just give some examples of the ways that environmentalists in the environment movement often talk about environmental preservation without advocating for the systemic reforms that are necessary to transform our system towards more environmental sustainability and racial equity. And so one example is about when you talk about divesting from fossil fuels, but not talking about divesting from the prison industry or the military. So one of the biggest polluters of carbon emissions is the US military. It pollutes more than most countries in the world by itself. It sends some of the most carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So if we're talking about divesting from oil, if we're talking about shutting down coal plants, then we also need to talk about not giving as much money to the military and to prisons who use a lot of oil, who use a lot of other types of practices that degrade the environment in this country and abroad. And also it's important to note that usually banks and corporations that invest in fossil fuels also invest in private prisons because they're able to produce products more cheaply, and there's less environmental regulations and labor rights in prisons, of course. So these two things are related. Another example of this is for advocating for natural places, protecting natural places and public lands, but not talking about returning land to indigenous communities. So a lot of the national and public lands in the US were taken from indigenous communities who sorted the land for centuries with regenerative practices. So I know in Florida, the Seminole tribes were one of the main tribes in Florida who were displaced because of plantation slavery, and also a lot of their land was annexed through treaties that were not ratified and that were not taken into account by the US. And so some of the lands that we call public lands actually are lands that belong to indigenous people. So if we want to protect natural places and public lands, then we also need to talk about returning the land to indigenous people and learning about the indigenous practices where they were stewarding the land for centuries, regenerating it for centuries until slavery happened and white European settlers came over. Next slide. So we're going to pause here for questions. Those are some slides from my training on Black liberation and environmentalism. I'll be doing that training again in August, and it goes over a little bit more history and moments connecting the geography of the US to slavery, to the environment, and to environmental liberation. And I know it's a lot to take in a short amount of time, so hopefully you can articulate some sort of questions, but just know that this is not at all comprehensive, and it's meant to be just a broad overview of some of these connections.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and unvideo yourself or video yourself if you want to ask a question, or if you don't want to be on video, you can also put it into the chat. And just a heads up, we will follow up. We have some resources at the end of this PowerPoint, and we'll send this PowerPoint out to everyone after the presentation. All right. I will share my screen again. All right, so just wanted to take a moment to emphasize that South Florida really is at ground zero for all of these effects of climate change and what they can do to our communities in terms of sea level rise, in terms of increased hurricanes. And so it's a lot of responsibility, but it's exciting because we can really set the stage for the rest of the country and other parts of the world. So we have a couple of groups that you guys can support that are already doing really amazing work and have put a ton of work into things you guys can do. But quickly before that, wanted to touch a bit about the connection between these environmental injustices and plastics, because it's something that not necessarily everyone knows, and it's really important and kind of shocking. So plastics are actually made from oil. I'm not sure how many people know that. A lot of the emphasis on plastics, or kind of the media about it's on the back end and all this marine debris, and there's not that much about it on the front end, and how plastics are literally a byproduct of oil production. And now that we have so much excess natural gas, we're actually taking ethane molecules or ethylene molecules and cracking them into ethane, which is the building block of plastics. So we're just taking this excess oil to make the building blocks to make more single-use plastics to try to find demand for this. And so that being said, these plastics contribute to the climate crisis. By 2050, single-use plastics are supposed to make up about 13% of the IPCC's global carbon budget. So by saying no to plastics, you'll be also saying no to these sea level rise and the climate gentrification issues that Teju and I've already covered. And also wanted to point out that these plastic production plants are largely located in minority communities, and they emit really terrible toxins to these communities. This figure here shows the counties with the largest oil and gas production, and it's shaded in terms of percentage of African American population. This one study by the Clean Air Task Force found that over 1 million African Americans live in areas where toxic air pollution is so high from natural gas facilities alone that it exceeds the EPA's recommended in terms of cancer risk, just from oil and gas in these counties. Some of the pollutants too that people might talk about: volatile organic carbons, nitrogen oxide, particulate matter is a big one that I'll come back to in a slide. And they're associated with so many symptoms, including tremors, headaches, reproductive impacts. There's so much more, but I want to zoom in on this section in Louisiana that's very dark in this map. This is known as Cancer Alley. There are literally dozens of petrochemical plastic production plants in this part of the Mississippi River that emits so many toxins that 7 out of the 10 census tracts in the US with the highest cancer risk fall on this part of the Mississippi. And there are reports out of some journals that talk about how in one city you can talk to every house and there's been at least one relative that has had cancer. And it's linked to these petrochemical emissions. And so this one example, you can clearly see the correlation between air toxicity levels and the proportion of Black residents.
So I want to just add that Cancer Alley is in St. James Parish in Louisiana, and it's one of the areas where the enslaved Blacks, after slavery was abolished, were given land from the plantation during Reconstruction to build their own communities. So these are some of the oldest communities in Louisiana and the historically African American communities. And so as petrochemical plants are trying to be built, they automatically go to this area because they know that the state is not going to do anything about it because it's a historically Black area. So St. James Rising is a nonprofit that has been fighting petrochemical plants in Louisiana for some time now, and they're currently fighting 2 that are being built among the, I think, more than 1,000 petrochemical plants that already exist in this region alone. And so one thing that happens is when we start to talk about divesting from oil and clean energy, petrochemical plants start to find other ways to produce oil-based products such as plastic. And when they go to these communities, they produce single-use plastic, which is used in grocery stores. And so the residents don't even have a choice on whether or not their products are wrapped in plastic because of the presence of these companies, these corporations. And so these connections between the history of Black people and Black space and plastic and oil-based products specifically has been going on for a long time, and it's a huge issue.
And bringing it to the current pandemic, there is a really strong connection between this type of pollution and the disproportionate mortality rates we're seeing in Black and brown communities. So I mentioned that particulate matter is one of those emitted particles from these petrochemical facilities. And a Harvard study found that like a small increase in atmospheric particulate matter can lead to a pretty significant increase in COVID-19 mortality rate. And the CDC has openly noted that these hospitalization and mortality rates are much higher in African-American communities. So it's a little bit too early to draw the direct connection in formal publication, but a lot of reporting is saying that these emissions from these plastic production plants to these minority communities is literally leading to disproportionate mortality rate. And it's a really terrifying thing to talk about and just terrible, but I just like to kind of emphasize that by fighting these plastic production plants, it's so much more than just saying no to the straw in the turtle's nose or saving the ocean. It's literally saving our people, and I just wanted to emphasize that.
And I want to just mention a book called Petrochemical America, and it's a book made by an artist in the South who sort of literally draws maps of all the petrochemical plants and pollution in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and talks about the relationship of the African American community there to the land and the cancer. And so it's a really good resource for people who are interested specifically in petrochemical plants in this region in Louisiana and Mississippi.
Awesome. Yeah, I will. If people aren't compiling resources in the chat, I'm writing stuff down so we can also include these resources when we follow up with the PowerPoint. And yeah, so before I even jumped into that, I wanted to emphasize that plastics play a role at every stage of their life cycle. So you've got the production, the consumption, and the disposal. And so with consumption, this has to do with food deserts. There are studies finding that food deserts exist in largely Black and brown communities. So this means there's very few grocery stores and supermarkets. So there's likely fewer options for food in terms of trying to avoid plastic packaged products. And there have been several studies documenting the chemicals leaching from plastic packaging into food associated with different health impacts from cancers and anxiety and whatnot. So consumption also plays a role. And then finally with disposal, just wanted to point out that the recycling rate of plastic is so incredibly low. This figure's from the EPA that shows the amounts that are incinerated and landfilled with the amount recycled as the small navy blue at the top. People estimate, or the EPA estimates that recycling rates sit at about 8.4%, but a couple other sources cite even as low as 2% when you consider what we say is recycled, but we actually just export it, and considering whether or not that actually is recycled. So it's really low, and without this recycling, again, it's largely getting landfilled and incinerated, and we know these landfills and incinerators exist in these Black and brown communities and disproportionately emit pollutants there. So every single stage of a plastic product can contribute to this environmental racism, which again is terrifying, but also empowering because we can do so much by inspiring collective action to avoid these types of products and support organizations that are also doing something about it.
And what's really important, thanks for saying that, Maddie, is that once we understand that the situation that we're in is by design, then we know it can be changed. It's not a natural situation that we're in. The links between racism and the environment have been put in place, and there are many institutions that keep these in place. So we know that it is possible to transform society because this is not the natural way. This is not a natural order, so to speak. And so I really encourage all of us to learn more about these links so that we can not feel so overwhelmed in the fight to change and shift what's possible in society and mitigate some of the consequences of the climate crisis.
Definitely. So our final slides are just some resources. We'll go through them real quick and then do a final round of questions. On the right, we have, these were resources from Teju's workshop. I don't know if you want to go through them in a second, but just some groups for you guys to support in Miami. Like I mentioned, Clio Institute is really great for climate change and climate gentrification. Family Action Network Miami also does some work in climate gentrification, but works with communities in Little Haiti for other social justice aspects, including immigration support, healthcare support, and education. And we're actually doing, quick plug, a donation-based virtual yoga class on Saturday at 10 o'clock, benefiting Family Action Network Miami. If you guys want to come, I'll follow up with that in the email as well. Miami Climate Alliance is actually a broader collective of organizations falling under it that Clio Institute and Family Action Network Miami are a part of. So I'm sure there's a whole heap of amazing groups under that. Grow Roots Miami and Urban Oasis Projects are both farming produce products, bringing food and produce to food deserts locally in Miami and providing better food access. And then the Big Blue and You and also the Upward Bound Impact Program are both two programs that are bringing students and youth from underserved minority communities to the ocean and to also the University of Miami to get some marine science experience and bring them to these natural environments. And then I put the Louisiana Environmental Action Network here because I'd read a bit about kind of their work with Cancer Alley, but I'll definitely add St. James Rising to that as well.
Yeah, I think the books and recommendations from my training are pretty self-explanatory, talking about environmental racism, indigenous relationships to the land, Black farming, racial ecologies. So I encourage you to just click through the links or Google some of the titles and lots of resources will come up.
Cool. And then she also has some upcoming workshops and also wanted to include her IG and website here.
Yes, so I'm currently doing a series called Alternatives Now and Interconnected Justice, where I talk about the ways some of the injustices in this country are connected and talk about different alternatives to the current system that is violent and oppressive to a lot of people. The sessions are every Wednesday at 12:30 Pacific time, 3:30 Eastern time. We've already had the first two sessions, and the last two sessions, the one next week is about intersectional movement building and how do you functionalize intersectionality now that you know about all these connections. What are ways to put that into the work that you do as an activist and as an ally? And then the last session, which is on the 29th of July, is about the language we use, which can be exclusive to some people, and how we use equity when we're telling stories of marginalized communities. And as I said, my Black liberation and environmentalism training will be happening again in August. I don't currently have a date, but feel free to follow me on Instagram or contact me through my website for other questions and resources and possible collaborations if you want support with anything that you're doing.
Awesome. I'll stop sharing so that everyone can hang out. Yeah, so we can take any remaining questions. have a discussion.
There are some questions in the chat. There was one, the initial one was asking about additional books, which we kind of went over, but maybe Teju, if you have any other books to recommend that kind of cover this topic.
I think starting with the list we have is a pretty hefty list to start with.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. There's also another question asking about integrating this into school curriculum, different opportunities or programs that are doing that work, or what you kind of see as the opportunities for that in the future.
I don't know any organizations specifically integrating this information into schools, but I assume there are individual teachers who are trying to find ways to add this information into school curriculum. And often when I'm asked specifically about how to talk about the environmental relationship between Black people and the environment, I often say that in most schools there's some section on slavery in the US. It's usually not a very big section, but that's a great way to talk about not only the oppression of Black people, but specifically how there was also the degradation of the land and monoculture and deforestation and all of the things that I mentioned. So really bringing it into history class and making history more of like an environmental history, I think is a good way to do that. And of course, people like me and others often do consulting around helping people include that into the curriculum. Sometimes it's a little bit easier when the school board is supporting this type of work as well, because there can be pushback, especially in the South, when you're trying to bring in some of this information into schools. Often it's not in schools because people don't want to talk about it because it makes people feel uncomfortable. So I think it's really important for teachers to find ways to integrate it, but making sure that you either are really bold or have the support is some of the first steps to making sure this happens. But I don't know any specific groups off the top of my head that do this, though I'm sure there are many.
And kind of the next question that we haven't really covered is just the most meaningful ways to engage in the struggles against environmental justice and just to support Black liberation. So just different ways to do that most helpfully.
Yeah, definitely supporting the organizations, the small organizations that are doing this work, fighting environmental injustice, supporting organizations like St. James Rising, and other smaller organizations that don't have as much funding. One of the main ways, especially right now, that you can be really supportive and help to Black liberation, and especially in terms of environmental injustice, is giving a monthly donation to an organization that is fighting environmental injustice. With all of the global uprisings against racism in this country and the world, a lot of organizations have gotten an influx of money at one period of time, but often it's really hard for these organizations to sustain themselves over time. So supporting these organizations on a consistent basis is really helpful, as well as always bringing in Black environmentalists, Black geologists, Black marine biologists, Black geographers when you can, when there are opportunities for education, for speaking, bringing in people who are of a different and diverse background who experience these issues on a very personal level is another way to support the work. And again, not just when it's in the media, not just when it's trending on social media, but on a regular basis, continuing to educate yourself, continuing to support those of us who are fighting for these issues, and recognizing the ways that you may contribute to it. If you move to a certain area that is being gentrified, looking for some groups that are fighting against gentrification, going to city town hall meetings, talking about pollution in communities, and really asking people who are most impacted what they think they need to be supported, what they think the solutions are, rather than deciding for yourself what they are. I would say those are some of the ways that can be really helpful and that are not necessarily tied to capitalism.
Yeah, I think that was great. I think we have one more if we have time. Just asking for tips in communicating, recentering environmental racism when being in a predominantly white activist space.
Well, I think it's extremely important to talk about environmental racism in a white activist space, because Black people don't do it to ourselves. We often are complicit in systems, and so when we learn about them, it's important that the people in privileged positions are the ones talking about them also. Racism is not an issue of Black people, it's an issue of white people who feel like they're white and use their power on and over Black people. And so it's extremely important for white people and white activists especially to be speaking about these issues and not only uplifting the voices of Black people when it comes time to talk about the hard topics, but also using your own voice to talk about the hard topics, using your own voice to talk about slavery and the history of slavery, and making it clear that the issue of racism and environmental degradation is not a Black issue, it's a human issue. And so everyone should be talking about it, everyone should be educating themselves about it, and everyone should be bringing it to the forefront in all of the spaces that they inhabit.
Awesome.
I think that was the last question. Yeah, if anyone else wants to ask anything, now's the time.
Cool. Well, thank you guys all so much for coming and staying with us for a whole hour. Like I said, this will be on Facebook if you guys want to rewatch it. We'll also send these slides out along with links. I think I saw Michelle asked about if they'll be able to access these links, and I will definitely get that to you guys. Cool. All right, I'm gonna stop going live on Facebook. Turn that off. Yeah, if you want to say hi. And thank you again so much, Teju. It's been a pleasure working with you. I look forward. I missed your workshop this week, but I've got them all marked down, so I'm hoping to make them work for the upcoming ones.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out, DFO, and keep doing the work that you're doing to help our oceans and seas stay clean. It's so important for all of the natural places that I love. So I'm really appreciative of that work. Glad we could do this together.
Me too.
Thank you so much.